I'm Carol Cohn, and welcome to Purpose 360, the podcast that unlocks the power of purpose to ignite business and social impact. Welcome back to the second part of my conversation with Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune Media. He just got so excited because we're having this great conversation that we ran so long that I wanted to cut this into two parts, because Alan has had a seat at the table with CEOs from around the globe for decades, and he has seen and witnessed the transformation of companies from shareholder-based management to stakeholder-based management, or as he calls it, creating human-centered organizations. This conversation with Alan, part 1 and part 2, is a playbook for all of my listeners who are in any part of their journey in purpose. It has incredible insights in terms of CEOs and how they have transformed their companies, their, oh my God, moments in time where they began to shift. And Alan just puts it in such a way to say this is now the new way for business to go forth, because there's a war for talent. Employees are at the center, and there's so much insights in here. Just let us know what you thought about this two-parter with Alan, because we're going to have him back in 6 or 9 months, maybe a year, and we're going to ask him how it's going, how much more companies are evolving and changing. So join me for part 2. What do you feel are the most prominent issues CEOs feel they must tackle today?
So it's interesting. I've had a great opportunity to sort of test this in the conversations that we've had at the CEO Initiative. I think in the first years, it was clear that the thing they felt most, I wouldn't say passionate about, but responsible for, was growing inequality and the lack of adequate opportunity. You know, there was a sense that John Kennedy said, a rising tide lifts all boats. There was kind of a sense that developed over the last decade that not all boats were rising. And the escalator of mobility that we had always been so proud of in American society had somehow broken down. And I think that one hit the CEOs more directly, because they're the ones who create jobs, right? So there was really a lot of really good conversations about what can we do to get that escalator moving again. And I think there's been good work on that. You know, one thing was, just as a starting point, for these big companies to go into their job postings and eliminate 4-year degree requirements where they're not necessary. That too often they were using credentials as a proxy for skills. And so a lot of the companies that we've been working with have done that, have said, hey, half of these jobs really don't require a 4-year degree. They require a certain set of skills. And there are people out there who have those skills that we're cutting out. So let's redefine them. And then a second piece was, having done that, can we create apprenticeship programs that bring people into the company maybe a little before they're ready, but people who we think have the basic talent, and we provide them the training either internally or externally to get them on the path so they can have successful careers at this company. So there are a lot of things like that going on. And then you see, even companies like Starbucks, what they're doing to make sure that the people who their baristas have access to good education. I mean, there's just been a lot of focus on that. So I would say that's number one. And number two is related: diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, business has really moved to, if not the forefront, certainly close to the forefront of the social equity debate in this country, starting with their own people, and then the third, but in the long run, probably the biggest, is climate, taking responsibility for climate. And again, you've seen just the geometric explosion of companies making net zero 2050 commitments over the last 2 years.
Yeah, and then how amazing when Microsoft said not only they're going to get to net zero, they were going to go back in time from the very beginning to offset all of their emissions and such, which was like an amazing proclamation.
Yeah. Yes. You know, Satya Nadella was our very first guest on Leadership Next 2 years ago.
Oh, I love him. He's great.
And also spoke at our CEO initiative meeting in Davos right before the pandemic started in January of 2020 to talk about those commitments. And what's powerful about that, Carol, that I didn't fully realize until recently, when these big companies like Microsoft and Walmart make these commitments and are serious about the commitments, it has an enormous effect down the line.
The ripple effect is really big.
The ripple effect is huge.
Yeah.
I think it was a few months ago, we had Soren Skoo, who is the CEO of Moller-Maersk, the big global shipping company, at one of our events. And he was talking about a big investment that they're making with a Danish power company to put wind farms in the North Sea to manufacture hydrogen fuel for their ships. And as I always do, I said to him, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "I'm doing it because I keep getting calls from my customers who say, I just made a commitment to get carbon emissions out of my transportation within 10 years. And if you don't do this, I can't meet my commitment and I won't be able to use your shipping." So you really start to see the downstream effects that these commitments have. It's pretty powerful.
And I love the fact that Microsoft was number one on the list of the Modern Board 25. And so I want to flip to that, because it's not just the CEO that is having the significant intellectual shift. It's also boards. So, kudos to you. You just announced this. Can you talk about why you created this initiative and how are boards changing?
I think it's really important. A lot of the skeptics about this movement, I remember having this conversation with Anand Giridharadas, who has written a couple of books that is very critical of the corporate movement towards ESG and social responsibility and so forth. And the reason he's critical is because he says, hey, these CEOs aren't accountable to anyone. These are government responsibilities. I don't want CEOs to be trying to make society better. I want the government to be trying to make society better. Well, I have two answers to that. Yeah. One is the government's not doing it. No. So somebody does. But the second answer is, well, in theory, they are accountable. They're accountable to their boards. So let's look at board governance. And our boards taking on the mantle of stakeholder capitalism, that they're responsible not just for making sure that the company delivers on its commitments to its shareholders, but also on its broader commitments to society. And that's why I think the Modern Board ranking, which we just started a couple of weeks ago, is so important, to make sure that boards are made up not just to represent shareholders, but to represent society, because this is where CEO accountability happens.
And you did it with Diligent. So can you talk a little bit about the methodology? Because I know when Fortune comes out with the rankings and ratings, as well as Just Capital, we get our clients the next day. We're getting an email. How do I get on this list? What do I do? So can you give us a little bit of a behind the curtain of the methodology for the Modern Board?
Diligent has a software platform that is used by tens of thousands of boards, which gives them unique access to data on these issues. And so that was the reason to partner with Diligent. They had the data to make this work. And look, we've tried to come up with the right criteria for experience, for diversity of viewpoints. You can read the methodology note. I won't go into it. I couldn't go into it in too much detail. Diligent has an institute that helped us with this.
Oh, good.
This is our first try at this. I don't know if we got it perfect or we got it right, but the effort is to say, hey, these are the kinds of people and the kinds of skills and the independence. Independence is an important part of it that you need to successfully navigate through this new world. And so that was how we judge them. And we'll have to see if our ranking holds up over time, and hopefully we can improve it over time. But I do think it's really important that that you start with boards, because boards are where the accountability lies.
And since you have done this, what are the boards really drilling down on in terms of the areas of stakeholder capitalism?
Definitely climate. I think they understand the importance of employees and monitoring the employee experience. It's interesting. I mean, traditionally, boards have been made up of like former CEOs, people who used to be something else. And that's created a little bit of a problem for them, because the world is changing so fast. And all these things that we're talking about may not have existed when they were in the CEO's job. So they have a lot to learn. I think that's the other thing that motivated our partnership with Diligent was we can't afford, in a society where things are changing this rapidly and where companies are stepping up and taking on these big social, geopolitical responsibilities, we can't afford to have boards that are behind the times. And so it both becomes a question of how do you pick directors, but it also becomes a question of educating directors. And we've started a newsletter that is designed to help do that, and a community that's designed to help do that.
You really take the responsibility of building community, educating incredibly well. So kudos to you. I'd like to talk about leadership qualities, because you talk about that in your book. And what are the new? I love that Hubert Joly, if you want, after the French accent, who I met for the first time at a Just event, and I adore him. He's going to be on the show. He's wonderful. Yeah, his wife's great. His wife's great too.
I haven't met his wife, but he'll all your podcast listeners should tune in for that one. He's a delightful leader.
It'll be great. So he says that the new model of business management today requires leaders who can create an environment that unleashes human magic.
Yeah, I love that.
It's great.
Look, and so, Carol, let me put that in historical context as well. Again, go back 50 years. The corporation of that time was kind of an information hierarchy. You had all these people out in the field who were selling, doing whatever the company does, collecting information. They would pass that information up the hierarchy. It would go to the top, and the CEO and his or her team, although in those days it was mostly his team, would take all that information, devise a strategy, and then send the orders back down, right? So it was, information up, have a strategy, we tell you what to do. No company works that way today. You can't work that way today. Things are moving way too fast. If you wait for somebody at the top to tell you what to do, you will already have missed the curve. And so leadership becomes very different. It's much less about telling people what to do and much more about inspiring them, motivating them, attracting them, giving the moral guidelines that they have to operate in, giving them the North Star that they have to approach. And I think that's what Hubert Joly means when he talks about the magic. Leadership is just very different, very different.
And how do leaders today, how do they know how to be empathetic? I mean, isn't that something you just feel? Can you learn to be empathetic?
That's a great question, Carol. I'm not sure I know the answer. What I can tell you for certain is there were no classes in empathy in business school.
Right. Yeah.
It's just not. I mean, there's a wonderful short Twitter video that I would urge your listeners to search and watch that Arne Sorensen, who was CEO of Marriott, who died of cancer last year, but he was CEO of Marriott. And when the moment came in 2020 where he realized that his business had gone almost to zero, right? You're in the hotel business. Nobody is staying in hotels. It was just, it dried up, and that he was going to have to do furloughs and layoffs on a massive scale. And he recorded this Twitter video to communicate to all the Marriott employees about what was going to happen and what he was going to do to try and support them through this tough time. And I think it's even it's just such a moving thing to watch, even more moving because he was well into his fight with cancer at the time. And, it was visible in his appearance, but it was just a powerful way of communicating and demonstrating vulnerability and empathy with employees that, as somebody who's watched this for a long time is so different than anything we saw 10 years ago. That was not the way Jack Welch led General Electric, It was not showing vulnerability was 10, 20 years ago was a no-no for leaders. But when you're trying to create a movement, when your company's success depends on the emotional connection with your employees, that kind of authenticity and vulnerability and empathy becomes just much more important.
Let's talk about empowering a workforce further. You're talking about, it was in your daily today, you're talking about the battle for talent. Talent is winning. They don't want to come back to work. They're going to be part-time. They're going to work whatever. And, we can have talent. I mean, my Carol Cone on Purpose is totally distributed. We're virtual. And we've got people from, Mexico to Europe to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So, and I'm in Florida. So, how do you empower the workforce today in a company that is leaning into it, whether it's Salesforce or others, to distributed talent?
I don't think anybody's cracked that nut yet, Carol, and I think it's an incredibly important question. What we learned during the pandemic was that distributed talent, work from home, could be every bit as productive, if not more productive, than working in an office. You take away the commute times. I live in the New York City area. My commute is anywhere from an hour to an hour and 45 minutes, depending on the traffic. And, you take back all that commuting time and the efficiency of Zoom calls. We learned that people could be very productive, but I firmly believe there was something lost. Human beings are social animals. I can feel it in my own organization. The people who knew each other and worked together every day and then moved to Zoom calls, they were fine. But the trust between organizations and the onboarding of new people, it just didn't work as well. And you see that in the Great Resignation. I mean, people in the last year, you see these stories about people who take jobs and then leave them within 3 months. We had some of those people, people who took a job and left it and were never even in the office, never met anyone face to face. So I think we have both an opportunity and a challenge. There were lots of things about office work that were soul crushing, right? That's why the Dilbert comic strip worked. That's why The Office was a great show to watch. There was a great deal of soul-crushing stuff that went on in offices, but there was also important stuff that happened. Personal, the kind of personal connection that only happens when you're face-to-face with somebody. It's just different. We are you got all the senses operating. And so how do we rebuild a workplace that, on the one hand, gives people the flexibility that they have earned during the pandemic to, figure out when they can do their work from home, but also recreates those social experiences that are so important to keeping organizations together and the level of trust high. And I talk to CEOs almost every day about this, and people are trying different things and they're redesigning offices, and some are saying 3 days a week and some are saying 2 days a week. I don't think anybody has found the silver bullet yet. And there may not be a silver bullet because we are people and we all have different needs.
There you go. I want to turn to the whole issue of CEOs as activists.
Yeah.
Because they can't stand on the sidelines anymore and they're getting dragged. You talked a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about it like currently. It is tough. How does the CEO decide where to engage, when to engage, how to engage, and when not to engage?
Yeah, it's really tough. And I think this comes back to a question you asked at the beginning, which is, do corporations really have a soul? Because it's the soul and the values derived from that drive this. You obviously can't get involved in everything. It'll kill you and kill your workforce. But you do have to decide the things that really matter to you as a company. and be willing to take a stand on that. And it's hard.
And you know what you said in one of your dailies? You said the storm always finds you.
Yeah, and there's a social media piece to that. These CEOs live in a glass bowl in a way they didn't 10 or 20 years ago. The tipping point for that was the moment when that doctor, David Dow, was dragged off of a United airplane was that in Chicago? Somewhere in the Midwest. Dragged off a United airplane. It's captured by video within 24 hours. People in China, the other side of the world, are canceling United flights because of their mistreatment. And the CEO, and this is really instructive, the CEO at the time, knew that the two guys who dragged the doctor off the plane were not United employees and was involved in some pretty difficult labor conversations. And so he decided to put out a statement standing up for his employees, saying you did the right things, which only added fuel to the fire. And it got even worse. Another great example of just how dramatically the world has changed. It's hard. You have to decide what your company values are. You have to be willing to stand up for those values, but you also have to figure out how to do that without getting yourself caught in the nasty nature of current politics.
Yeah. I knew when Nike supported Colin Kaepernick. I'm a shoe dog. I grew up in the shoe industry. I knew that was exactly the right thing to do. And, the stock dove, and then I knew it climbed right back up because who's their constituent? So that's really important. I want to ask you a bit. You're a journalist, and I know a lot of our listeners, they've created very strategic, authentic, purpose, stakeholder engaged programs. How do they get the communications out in the best effective way in today's snackable, hard to get anybody's attention? You're a journalist. What's your advice to companies on their communications around their authentic efforts?
Well, first of all, it has to be authentic, right? Because journalists and the sniffers, society at large, the social media crowd will figure it out quickly if it's not. You can't do what BP tried to do a decade ago with, we're going to call ourselves Beyond Petroleum, even as we, have these derricks in the Gulf of Mexico that are going to pollute the world. So it does have to be authentic. And I know a lot of people who are in the public relations business who, have work for people who come to them and say, fix this problem for me, get this message out there. And they go back and say, well, you can't get the message right without getting the thing right. So I think that's the first thing. But second, look, there's both a challenge and an opportunity in terms of dealing with media. The challenge is it's such a diverse set of players. They don't have the depth of the expertise that they did in the old days because they don't have time to develop depth or expertise. So it's very challenging dealing with the outside media world. That's the challenge. The opportunity is you don't really have to. Companies can do a lot of this on their own. They have lots of, your employees are an important source of communicating to the outside world, your social media channels. The truth is, if you look at Richard Edelman's surveys, the truth is people trust their employer more than they trust any of us in the media because the media has become such a diverse mess. I hate to say this as somebody who's been in media my whole life, but my advice is, first of all, if you're going to deal with the media, make sure you're dealing with someone you can trust in the media. But second, recognize your own power. You are a source of media and be smart about how you use your employees and your customers and your whole range of stakeholders to communicate the values, which gets back to why it has to be authentic. You can't have one message for the world and a different message for your employees or your customers.
Yeah, you can't say we're the best in DEI, and then you look at your board, your employee makeup, but it's not. It's like, oh my God, you're definitely in trouble. I want to ask you about terms because I just wrote this blog. I sent it off about there's all these different words. There's purpose and there's shared value and there's CSR and ESG, whatever.
ESG.
Yeah. So I'm just curious about how you deal with the term. First, let's deal with the term purpose. You know, can you just give us your definition of purpose? And then, why is that important for an organization to have a purpose?
So purpose is something we all understand innately. We all want to have a purpose in life. I think purpose for an organization is probably something that has always been there in the very best organizations. If you talk to somebody like Jim Collins, you may have had him on your
and I've
show.
met him. I love Jim Collins. Yeah, he's great.
He's a brilliant man, but he'll tell you there's nothing new under the sun. The best companies have been purpose driven from day one. And you take a company like Johnson and Johnson, they have their purpose written very clearly on their credo, and they live by it. Everybody in the company knows it and understands it. So I do think that's something that has been pretty fundamental in terms of motivating people from the beginning. But again, what's changed, I think about this in terms of, I try and keep myself out of it, but if I think about my father and think about my children, how differently they approach the workplace. My father was a child of the Depression. I know he went to work to make money. If he wanted to do good in the world, he would go to his church, he would go to his Rotary Club meeting, whatever, but he went to work to make money. My children are very different. They don't belong to a church. They don't belong to a Rotary Club. Their employer is in some ways, it's definitely their most important. In some ways, their only formal connection to society. And they just heap all those expectations on the employer. So purpose is not new, but the heaping of purpose, expectations, and ambitions on the employer is kind of new. And I think that's what has changed in the last 50 years.
Okay, let's talk about ESG.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be the hot term of the day. And we're getting all sorts of different, what does it mean? Is it this or that? So I'd love to hear from Alan Murray, the definition of ESG in relation to this entire conversation.
Well, it's a horrible term. I mean, government bureaucracies are not the best place to come up with good
That's funny.
Semantics. It's environment, it's social, and it's government. We've talked about all three of those pieces. They're very important. I mean, in some ways, I go back to what I said earlier, that what this is really about is creating human-centered organizations. And yes, and the S is explicitly about that. Organizations that pay attention to the needs of their employees and their customers. But the environmental part is also the same. In the long run, people can't thrive if the planet doesn't thrive. G is more complicated, but it kind of gets back to the conversation you and I were having about boards, that you have to have a system of accountability in order to hold companies responsible if they're going to take on the environmental goals and the social goals. So they kind of all fit together, but they also can conflict, and it's complicated. And I use the acronym, but I'm not crazy about it.
Okay. What's your favorite acronym for this whole movement?
I like stakeholder capitalism, but I think a lot of people don't really understand what that is either. So I think probably at the end of the day, the best way to talk about it is human-centered capitalism, human-centered business. We're in a new era.
Okay, we're going to give you a new name, a new era. That's the second book.
Yeah,
that's the next book. So you write in the book, in the long run, there's no trade-off between purpose and profits. So can you highlight for C-suite leaders and their teams 3 of the most important areas they must think about on this whole new future of business?
3 most important areas that they have to focus on.
Sorry for the hard one. But then, of course, read the whole book, because you'll have all this great, delicious detail.
It is hard. I mean, let's deal with the easiest first. I know climate science is filled with uncertainties, and that we too often treat it as though it is filled with certainties. I recognize all of that, but I think the evidence now has reached the point where it's clear that the planet is in danger over the course of the next 100 years. And any company that wants to be around 100 years from now needs to have a stake in making sure that the planet isn't destroyed over that period of time. So that one's easy. You have to incorporate that into your thinking and your planning and your long-term strategy. The second is the S, the social part, the people. And here is where diversity and equity and inclusion come in. You will not survive as a business if you're trying to survive on some subset of the workforce, because there's just not enough people to go around. So you've got to make your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then you've got to recognize what you and I talked about earlier, that these people are the source of your value as a company. You've got to treat them well. You've got to look after their whole lives. You have to care about their mental health. And if you don't do that, you will not survive. So I guess the third is that it's now apparent in advanced societies that technology is driving increased inequality, and that increased inequality over time will lead to social disruption. So you have to look beyond the walls, the confines of your company, and ask yourself, what can I do to address this? How can I create a system that works better for everyone, not just better for my employees? So I guess those would be my three.
Oh, those are great. And of course, there's so much more. And the book, Tomorrow's Capitalist, is just rich with so much guidance. I'm going to put it bookended next to Net Positive, which is Paul Pullman's book. And those are the two.
Great book, yeah.
Great book. I want to ask you about issues. What issues do you wish companies would take on that maybe aren't the most popular or common, but Alan Murray says, I wish, or the smart company should take on these issues?
It's a great question. I've been thinking about this because I'm doing an essay for our former sister publication, Time Magazine, on what has stakeholder capitalism missed? What are the forgotten issues? The issues that were left behind.
Oh, I've got one for you.
I'll take yours in a minute, but I'll give you my four. I identified four of them. One is taxes, because at the same time, these companies in the Business Roundtable have developed this new sense of stakeholder capitalism and positive contribution to society. They have these legacy organizations. The Business Roundtable itself has a large lobbying organization that are devoted to maneuvering, calculating, lobbying to ensure the absolute minimum tax bill possible. And if you care about your impact on society, it can't be the right position to say, I want to pay as little or no taxes to support that society. So I think companies are going to have to rethink how they do taxation. I was told by one of the CEOs of one of the big four that they're starting to hear that people are starting to ask them not just what taxes do I have to pay, but what taxes should I pay? Not just what's legally possible, but what's morally right. That's new and that's important.
Wow.
So that's one thing.
Okay.
Two, I think CEO pay has to get some attention. CEO pay has exploded. Instead of 30 or 40 times the average worker, which is what CEOs made a couple decades ago, they now make 300 or 400 times the average worker. Much of that has come from stock incentives, and shareholders are, for the most part, if it's done correctly, are fine with that, because the shareholder says, look, if you're making me lots of money, I'm okay with you making lots of money. But I'm not sure society is fine with that. In a world where inequality is increasing, I just think they're and where CEOs are asking for more trust to step up and deal with these hard social problems, I'm not sure a system that compensates them at 300 times the rate of the average person is going to be accepted. So I think that's a problem that they kind of hide from, and they need to figure out a better way to address it. The third is the whole voting rights debate in the U.S. Before the last election, a lot of CEOs were standing up and saying, it's our position. One of the things we value is making sure everybody votes. The more people who vote, the better off we are. And we're in favor of that. But then after the election, when this became the flashpoint for the kind of the fiercest partisan debates, it got a little squishy. I mean, Ed Bastian of Delta and James Quincy of Coca-Cola came out against the Georgia voting rights law, but then they kind of got quiet. And I think because they don't want to be in a Bob Chapek situation, they don't want to be in the middle of a political brawl. So they haven't quite figured out how to reconcile the value, which is the more people who vote, the better, with the fact that if they articulate that value, they suddenly find themselves in the fiercest political fight of all, and they don't want to be in that fight. And then the last one is China.
China, okay.
Is China.
Okay.
If companies have values, what do you do when you're operating in a system whose values are completely different from yours? I mean, we know what stakeholder capitalism means in China. There's one stakeholder that matters. It's Xi Jinping, the man who runs the society. And so I think the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has really thrown that into high relief. And a lot of companies and a lot of boards are saying, geez, if this were China, where our business is, by the way, 10 or 20 times larger than it is in Russia, China invading Taiwan, what would we do? So I think those are some of the big issues that have to be grappled with to make this
big thorny issues. I look forward to reading it. An issue I'd love you to consider is substance use disorder.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's we actually work with a very small not-for-profit called Shatterproof, which I'd love to send you some background. But truly, now that you've had the decision in terms of all the opioid settlements, and it's kind of like tobacco and substance use. It's a partner with mental health.
Yeah.
And you saw that during there were 100,000 people died during the pandemic from substance use disorder. And now you've got fentanyl and other things that are just, kids are going out to like party on Saturday and they die. So that's one, it needs support. It's
a good one, Carol. And I don't think business has fully come to terms with its role in the opioid crisis to begin with. I mean, particularly some of the big drug distribution companies. Yes. Yeah, who they had all the data to know what was going on, that they were shipping like ridiculous amounts of opioids into West Virginia counties, but they didn't take responsibility for.
This has been such a great conversation. Is there anything else that you would love to just end with? You've been so gracious and generous with your time. Tomorrow's Capitalists, my search for the soul of business. What's your parting comment, Alan Murray?
I guess the one thing that I would say, because I know there's a lot of cynicism out there, the one thing I would say is I don't think business can solve all our problems. I don't think business should solve all our problems. I don't think there's some kind of silver bullet going on here. I don't think greed has been eliminated. I don't think corporate corruption has been wiped off the face of the earth. But there is something going on here that is very significant and very real. And at the end of the day, it is a good thing.
That's beautiful. That is a great conclusion to a marvelous conversation.
Carol, thank you so much. This has been fun for me.
It's been great. So hopefully, you know what? I'd love to invite you back in maybe a year.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind. I mean, Martin's been on the show at least a couple times a year, but you've got such a seat at the table. And I think that your voice, yes, you're a journalist, but I see you in a way like our U.S. Paul Pullman.
Which that is quite a compliment. Thank you.
So wonderful. So every day
I will come back.
Oh, good. All right, then we got it, listeners. And so it's going to be a great show. I bet we also do an ebook. So for our listeners, we always take our top 25 podcasts. We put in an ebook. It's like snackable, and we put that out. And I bet you're going to be the number one most listened to because last one it was Paul. So thank you, Alan Murray, CEO of Fortune Media. You are a knight in shining armor for business.
Oh, thank you, Carol. It was a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for everything you've been doing much longer than I have, by the way. I don't mean to. As I said earlier, I think I'm older than you are.
No, we're both young.
But you gained your purpose earlier than I did.
I was very fortunate to do that. So thank you. And we can't wait to have you come back. And listeners, please go to your favorite place where you listen to your podcast and rate us. Alan's podcast has got a gazillion 5 stars. We need a few more gazillion 5 stars so that our Purpose podcast, Purpose 360, sits alongside of Leadership Next because it's great. So thank you, Alan Murray.
Should be everyone's must listens.
Oh, you're sweet. Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.